A small, dimly lit bar in Florida. The hum of an old jukebox barely cuts through the thick air. Aileen Wuornos stares ahead as her drink sits untouched in front of her. Her face is worn by years of hardship, and yet, behind her eyes, there is a storm brewing, a darkness that would soon make her infamous. Aileen was no stranger to a difficult life. Born in Michigan in 1956, she was abandoned by her parents and raised by her grandparents, but their home was far from stable. By the age of 11, she was living on the streets, using her body to survive. These early years of trauma would carve the path for the monster she would become. This was the late 1980s when Aileen turned from a troubled drifter into something far more sinister. In December of 1989, she met Richard Mallory, her first known victim. Aileen, now working as a prostitute, got into Mallory's car, and the two drove to a secluded wooded area. But what happened next was not part of her usual routine. In the shadows of the dark, remote spot, Aileen shot Mallory multiple times, killing him. Later she claimed it was self-defense, that Mallory had tried to assault her and she acted out of fear. But the brutality of the crime raised suspicions, and this was only the beginning. Over the next year, 6 more men would meet the same fate. Aileen's modus operandi was chillingly consistent. She would flag down her victims on Florida highways, luring them into secluded areas before gunning them down in cold blood. After each killing, she would take her belongings, sometimes using their cars, leaving little evidence behind. Each victim was found shot multiple times, and with every body discovered, the police became more desperate to track down the killer. But Aileen, living with her girlfriend, Theria Moore, kept a low profile. She moved from one cheap motel to another, living hand to mouth and relying on her stolen goods to fund her chaotic life. Despite her violent acts, Aileen clung to her relationship with Theria, hoping it would fill the void in her life. Theria was Aileen's only real connection, but even that relationship was tainted by lies and manipulation. As the bodies continued to pile up, the authorities were closing in. In January 1991, Aileen was finally arrested at a bar called The Last Resort. It was a fitting end for a woman whose life had been marked by depression and violence. She had no idea the police were watching her, gathering enough evidence to link her to the murders. But it was her love for Theria that ultimately sealed her fate. The police convinced Theria to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Over the phone, Theria persuaded Aileen to confess, and within days, the truth came tumbling out. Aileen admitted to the killings, but she remained insistent that each murder was an act of self-defense. Aileen's trial was a media circus. The world was fascinated by the notion of a female serial killer, a rarity in itself. Aileen, however, seemed indifferent. She entered the courtroom with a defiant gaze, but underneath the bravado, she was an undeniable sense of defeat. Her defense tried to paint her as a victim of abuse, someone who had been driven to kill out of fear, but the prosecution countered that Aileen was a predator, luring men to their deaths without remorse. It didn't take long for the jury to reach a verdict. In January 1992, Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death for the murder of Richard Mallory. The other convictions followed swiftly after, each one adding more weight to the already damning case. Aileen herself seemed resigned of her fate, at times lashing out in court, at other times quietly accepting the inevitable. For years, Aileen sat on death row. During that time, her story continued to captivate the public. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer, while others believed she was a tragic failure shaped by years of abuse and neglect. In interviews, Aileen's erratic behavior only deepened the mystery surrounding her true motives. Was she the victim she claimed to be, or was she simply a woman who had lost her grip on reality? In 2002, after more than a decade on death row, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. In her final statement, she said she would be back, just like in movies with Jesus by her side. Aileen Wuornos remains one of America's most infamous female serial killers. Her life was a tragic descent into madness, violence, and ultimately death. But her legacy endures, a chilling reminder of how a life marked by pain can lead to unimaginable horror. The story of Aileen Wuornos is not just about the crimes she committed, but the circumstance that led her to that dark path. While many of the details remain clouded for her own conflicting accounts, one thing is certain: her reign of terror left an undeniable mark on history, and the scars of her violence are still felt today.